Honorable members of the tribunal, Sulankar madam, Humle sir, Patil sir, Kaprathura sir, Pradeep, president of the association, my dear friends. I think the concept of composite and mixed supply is not really new to us. And before we really go and discuss this topic from the perspective of the GST law, maybe we can spend a few minutes looking at what we have seen over the last few decades. And I can really imagine this issue really has been bothering us sometime since 1958, all the way till date. We are still confused, and I believe we might continue to be so for some more time to come. If we step back a bit, this nature of this transaction has bothered us in various aspects. We had the first challenge, we had construction contracts, we analyzed them, 9 STC in 1958, to say, are these really, what are the nature of these transactions? Are these really transactions of sales of goods? And Gannon-Dunkley was the first decision of the Supreme Court, where we said that these are not transactions of sale, these are services, or these are composite transactions, so to speak. And of course, that was not the end of the matter. We went on to really debate printing contracts. We had various decisions. The old decision of Anantham Vishwanathan, 1973 STC. We went on to Sarvodaya Printing Press to say that printing contracts are in the nature of works contracts, effectively again saying that these are in the nature of composite in nature, where there is an element of goods as well as services. Photography was always a big challenge. We started again very early. BC Kame was the initial one, which you will all remember. We went on to a decision of the West Bengal Tribunal, Studio Kamalaya. We discussed Rainbow Color Lab, a lot of discussion around that, and finally we settled with the Magic Creative. And then we went on to again a very interesting decision on dyeing and bleaching. Matoshri was a sort of a decision out of the blue, where we said this is again a transaction of a works contracts, which we always believed was a transaction of a service. And suddenly the Bombay High Court said, no, this involves passing of property and it's a composite transaction. And of course, we had further development for photocopying contracts. The earliest one was Everest Copiers, the last one was Hari and Company. And of course, then another very interesting aspect was pest control, which again we always treated as services, suddenly has been held and confirmed to be a transaction of sale. And whilst we grappled with all these kinds of transactions, it is not that our law, the Bombay Sales Tax Act at the relevant time and the Maharashtra VAT law later on, was completely oblivious to these kinds of transactions, or what we are going to analyze today to be transactions in the nature of a composite or a mixed supply. We already had provisions in our Maharashtra Value Added Tax Act. The sale price already made a provision for valuation, and when we talk about the levy of tax, we talk about the levy and the measure of tax. And in the provision related to the measure of tax, we provided, it said, any sum charged for anything done by the seller in respect of the goods at the time of or before delivery, other than cost of insurance and for transit and installation were separately charged. Therefore, we already had this element or a concept of bundling transactions to bring in certain expenses or charges into the value of the sales or the supply at the relevant time. And it was made not only in the Maharashtra VAT law, we already had that provision or a similar provision under the Bombay Sales Tax Act, Section 229 of the BST Act. In a very slightly, and of course, on this concept, of course, lots of litigation. We saw the earliest of decisions and the disputes to say whether freight should be added, freight should be excluded, or should form part of the sale price. And all those discussions were there. It started from Hindustan Sugar, then it went on to Parle Products. India Meters was the last one, which was really discussed these concepts. We had a very interesting provision under the VAT law, the rate of tax on packing materials. And the law said that the rate of tax on packing materials shall be the same rate as applicable to the goods which are being sold. Again, a concept of bundling, which was always there. All I'm trying to explain is that this is not something new for us. It's in a way quite similar, though certain principles do change when we go into the GST law. And here, of course, you'll remember very fondly the decision of Rajshil, because for many of us, that was a classic example of where they had given to say wine sold in a crystal bottle. Is this a separate sale of a packing material, or is this a packing material which is part of the goods which are being sold? The service tax law really did not go, was not very far behind, but a very interesting provision you need to read in the context of services, which will become very relevant for our discussion today. The first clause, it says, reference to a service, hereinafter referred as a main service, shall not include to a service which is used for providing the main service. Effectively, when they talked about bundling or the classification of services, the service tax law provided that when you are trying to identify the nature of a service or the classification of the service, look at the service which is being provided to the customer. Do not look at the services which you are using to provide that service. The input should not be looked at when you are determining the classification for the output. And that was a concept which we went ahead with. There was a slightly more detailed provision under section 66F of the service tax law, which says when various elements of a service are naturally bundled in the ordinary course of business, it shall be treated as provision of a single service which gives the bundle an essential character. So they said when there are lots of services were bundled together into a single or a composite, the essential character will help you determine the classification of the service. And if the elements of the services are not naturally bundled, then it shall be treated as a single service which results in the highest liability of service tax. Which was to say, in the case of any other service which are not naturally bundled, you have to pay that tax at the highest applicable rate, which was quite fine. And therefore, this is the kind of provisions which was really made under the provisions of the service tax law. The GST law obviously has to carry forward these concepts. Although we are integrating the taxation of services and goods into a common law, these concepts need to be carried forward in order to identify them, in order to classify the goods and services and pay the right taxes. Had we had a single rate GST, there would never be a problem. But with a multiple rate GST, this classification obviously becomes extremely critical. And therefore, when we go to the CGST law, very quickly, we're looking at section 8. And section 8 gives us the reason why we really need to have this discussion today. The distinction between composite and mixed supply. It says a composite supply comprising of two or more services, one of which is a principal supply, shall be treated as a supply of such principal supply. So you pay tax at the rate applicable to the principal supply, ignore the ancillary or the incidental supplies in the case of a composite supply. And we will discuss in a minute what is the meaning of this composite and composite supply. In the case of a mixed supply, it says a mixed supply comprising of two or more supplies shall be treated as supply of that particular supply which attracts the highest rate of tax. Again, you go by the highest rate because there are multiple supplies, you cannot identify which one is a principal, which is an ancillary, and therefore you pay tax at the highest applicable rate. At the same time, interestingly, while we are talking about this concept of composite, and we have a very specific provision under section 8 which was not there earlier in the VAT law at least, we still continue the legacy of our valuation rules. And if you go back to the valuation rules, section 15, it says the value of supply shall include any incidental expenses including commission, packing, charged by the supplier to the recipient, and any amount charged for anything done by the supplier in respect of the supply of goods or services, or both at the time of or before delivery of the goods or supply of services. So while you have talked about bundling goods, you have also left a provision for valuation. So you have now two provisions which you really need to identify. When do you apply the provisions relating to valuation to bring in a value into a supply, or when do you really talk about bundling and then getting into a discussion or a distinction between a composite and a mixed supply. So let us now quickly run through the definition. And the definition, if I may quickly read, it's a short definition but a few important aspects to be borne in mind. The composite supply means a supply made by a taxable person to a recipient consisting of two or more supplies of goods or services or both, or any combination thereof, which are naturally bundled and supplied in conjunction with each other in the ordinary course of business, one of which is a principal supply. So it's really bringing about 3 or 4 different concepts. It's talking about one supply. It starts with a supply. Now that itself creates a little bit of confusion to say how can you have a supply consisting of 2 supplies. So that again is a dichotomy of sorts in the interpretation, and that's where we are all going to run to the tribunal someday to say please guide us, how do I really look into this. And then we go further to say which are naturally bundled and supplied in conjunction. Conjunction meaning together at the same time simultaneously. And therefore it goes further to say in conjunction with each other in the ordinary course of business. That means in the normal course of business, in the normal course of trade, these have to be supplied together or are required to be supplied or undertaken together. And one of which of course is a principal supply. They are given an example to say There's an illustration which says where goods are packed and transported with insurance, the supply of goods, packing materials, transport and insurance is a composite supply, and the supply of goods is the principal supply. It's an illustration to guide us on how it has to be interpreted. Look at how principal supply is worded. It says principal supply means the supply of goods and services which constitutes the predominant element of a composite supply, and to which any other supply forming part of that composite supply is ancillary. So there's a principal, there's an ancillary or an incident supply. Quickly looking at the definition of mixed supply. Mixed supply says two or more individual supplies. Now bear in mind, earlier composite said two or more taxable supplies. Mixed supply says two or more individual supplies. So it could be taxable, they could be non-taxable. Of goods or services or a combination thereof made in conjunction with each other by a taxable person for a single price, where such supply does not constitute a composite supply. So again, it is sort of excludes composite supply, and it says if I'm not a composite supply, then you really need to look into the question of a mixed supply. And therefore there's a sequence required to be followed. There's an illustration which talks about supply of a package consisting of canned foods, sweets, chocolates, cakes, dry fruits, aerated drinks and fruit juices when supplied for a single price is a mixed supply. Each of these items can be supplied separately and is not dependent on any other. It shall not be a mixed supply if these items are supplied separately. So if we supply them as a package like a gift hamper, then this becomes a mixed supply. For all the items in the gift hamper, identify the highest rate of tax and pay tax at the highest rate. But obviously this happens when the gift hamper is sold at a single price, say 1000 rupees for the gift hamper. If you say a gift hamper comprising of 8 items and prices attributed to each of these 8 items, then it will not fall within the realm of a mixed supply. It goes out and becomes an independent or an individual supply. Now really when you are looking at these definitions,
that's why we have used that single and individual supply, because even if a tax free,
right, two or more individual supplies. But I'm just explaining, yes, that's why there could be a tax free supply which obviously will get taxed since it's a mixed supply. Absolutely so. Now when you're really looking at composite supply and you have all these definitions, we've already seen these are elements which you're going to compare. Don't forget, or please bear in mind, there's still an important element before you really look at these two definitions. The concept of a supply simpliciter. And when we are really going to analyze any transaction, you'll have to look at all these 3 concepts in parallel, and you'll have to go sequentially to say first analyze whether a transaction is a supply simpliciter. If it is not, then is that a composite supply? And if it is not a composite supply, does it then become a mixed supply? So there could be a lot of transactions which will really create a lot of confusion to tell us, is it really a supply simpliciter, or do we need to go further to analyze the distinction between a composite or a mixed supply? And let me take maybe a couple of thoughts on this. You might have various elements or activities in a supply. For example, in order to provide a supply, I have to do various activities, and as the earlier service tax law says, reference to a supply does not include a reference to all the services which are used to provide the supply. That means the inputs will not really have a bearing on the output, and therefore the question is, many times the whole concept gets vitiated or it gets confused because there are so many elements of an inputs, the expenses which you incur to provide a supply. The supply may be singular, but you incur a lot of these expenses in order to provide or render this service or make this supply, which creates a little bit of confusion. I'll explain this with an example in the next slide. So the first question you're going to see is that are these various services which you're looking at, are these really inputs or are these really output which are being received by the recipient? Do these constitute supplies which are received by the recipient? The distinction between input and output, and that is an important element of it. And as I was saying, we will come into a quandary many times where we'll confuse the input with the output to really determine how this needs to be classified. So if I look into the parameters, the first element to be seen is, are these elements or the taxable supplies referred to in the definition of composite supply, are these expenses or are these activities which have to be undertaken in order to make a supply? Let me give you an example. If I buy a television set, usually when I buy a television set, they always deliver the television set to my residence. Now, to deliver that television set to my residence, and I may have paid him 30,000 rupees for that, he is going to obviously also engage a transporter. So far as I am concerned, it's a single output or a by purchase of a television set, but there are two elements which are forming the total cost of the 30,000 rupees. Maybe 29,000 rupees is the cost of the television set, 1,000 rupees is the cost of the supplier or the retailer to supply the television set. So now whether for me as a buyer of the television set, will I say, am I receiving two services or two supplies, or am I receiving a single supply? He is having two activities which he needs to really undertake, or two expenses he needs to incur in order to supply the television set. And that therefore my submission is that when we analyze this, we really should not look at what are the composition of the or the constituents of the expenses incurred by the supplier to determine the output supply. My output supply may be a singular supply. It may have various elements or expenditure which need to be incurred by the supplier to really render that single final consolidated supply. And the last is there any optional or additional supplies? Are there examples of any distinct, independent or additional supplies which really will form part of this supply? Let me give you a very simple example. Jewelry. Whenever our wives go and buy jewelry, they always get a bill which says price of the gold and making charges. How are we now going to translate this or interpret this when we come to GST law? Will it form into the realm of a composite supply? Because on the bill I am saying making charges, I am saying price of gold. Is it going to be a mixed supply, or is it going to be a simple supply or a supply simpliciter, as I may call it? Obviously the answer is this is nothing but a supply simpliciter. It is purchase of jewelry. It constitutes two level of expenses so far as the supplier is concerned, but that does not really change the nature of the transaction qua the buyer. Let me give you a slightly different example. A very common example for convention services. And this is where again you are going to have a little bit of a confusion. There could be convention services will have a conference room, will have accommodation for the delegates, will have meals, will have other facilities which you use at the convention center, maybe the gym, maybe the business center. How are you really going to treat this? Will you call it a composite supply? Because ultimately for STPAM or the GSTPAM now, we are going to receive convention services from the Taj, and of course all the delegates are going to receive all these four different individual supplies. So when the GSTPAM receives and pays an invoice, is this going to be classified as a composite supply? Or will you say it's a mixed supply, because we perhaps are going to pay a single price for the 100 delegates who are going to go for this seminar, and therefore it's going to be a mixed supply, and therefore you're not going to be able to segregate all of these from one another? Or will you say that this is nothing but a single supply? Really, if you look at this, the confusion which is getting created is in the convention service, and all the four elements, which is the conference room, accommodation, the meals, and the gym or the business center, there is no principal supply. If you see, there is no principal supply at all, and therefore the definition of composite supply really fails. They are provided in conjunction with one another. They are naturally bundled. They are provided in the ordinary course of service. But what is the principal supply? The principal supply is completely different than these four elements. The principal supply is a convention service. So it goes out of the composite supply. Similarly, then you are saying it's a single price, and therefore I'm left with the definition of mixed supply. Shall I go for a mixed supply? Maybe one way of looking at it to say this is a mixed supply. However, although they are supplied in conjunction and for the simple price, the question really remains, or the confusion will remain between a mixed supply and a supply simpliciter. If you ask me, this will appropriately be classified as a supply simpliciter, which is a convention services. It might have four elements of the supply which are required to be made, but you cannot really now take this four elements and say I will find out the rate of tax on these four items and I'll apply the highest rate of tax. And that is also what is a principle which has been accepted in the GST law, because we have a separate entry for levy of tax on convention services. Had we said that this was a mixed supply, we did not require a separate rate of tax. The law recognizes this. The law provides a separate rate of tax on convention services. And that is the way we'll have to really interpret the distinction between an input and an output to really classify these transactions. I hope I'm not making this too heavy.
Madam has to go and all the tribunal members have to attend some meeting. That's why they are leaving now. On behalf of GSTPAM, I thank Madam for coming and guiding us. We'll remember always that we are the student always for a lifetime. Thank you, Madam. I thank all the other members of the tribunal who have come and blazed the occasion. Thank you very much, sir. I request all the delegates to thank you.
No problem for me. I hope I'm not creating too much confusion. I assure you, after 1 hour, we were confused, and you will say from confusion to confusion confounded. But this topic is such, and we were just deliberating amongst some of our friends and members to how are you going to really interpret this, because if you do not put some elements or some boundaries around the interpretation, it will really take you in a very different arena, where someone may say for a convention services also, I'll find out the highest rate of tax. Say you're doing it in a 5-star hotel is 28%, I'll give you 28% because that is the highest rate of tax. And I don't think that is the way you can really read this. It's a single service, it's a single supply, has 4 elements. An activity or an element does not constitute a supply in itself. The invoice will be one, it has to be for a single price, and then you might still say the breakup of the price is always you might have an annexure, you might have a schedule. But anyway, it's a recognized principle under the law. And therefore, coming back, this is where you really end up to say, I'm repeating the whole the discussion again, coming back to say, are these various activities which we are really evaluating, are these really elements or activities in a supply, or is this really a supply which is a bundle supply received by the recipient, or are these optional supplies? And here you are going to find a lot of these issues and cases which are going to come up. You might look at a supply of a machine on a CIF basis, no problem. Now again the same question as a television set which is sold to me, it comes to my residence, effectively I am saying it's CIF, then would you say it's a supply of a television set, or is it a bundle supply of a television set with transportation or maybe transit insurance if it is coming from someone's godown somewhere? And again, although to my mind, when my agreement is for supply of a television set, there is no separate charge. I will want to rather interpret this to be a single supply or a supply simpliciter for the sake of discussion. However, supply of a machine with a maintenance pack, with packing, insurance and freight. And we are going to discuss all of these later on also. I'll just run through this list. So you might have a different situation when you're supplying the machine with packing, insurance and freight. A maintenance package, again, you'll have a different answer. Convention service we have already discussed. Denting, painting of vehicles will pose a problem. And here you'll have a very different answer when you compare it with repair of vehicles. Hotel accommodation is going to be a challenge by itself, whether it is accommodation with pickup and meals, just pickup or use of various services in a hotel. Let's take all of these one at a time. And let's get the obvious out of the way. The first is works contracts. So what happens to works contracts? And what I've done is, I've taken, for the sake of our discussion, the example, left the parameters over here so that it's easier for each one of us to follow. And the whole question is, how are we going to really treat works contracts? Where do we really classify this? We all agree that these are composite supply, but there is no real discussion required over here because you have treated it as a supply of services. You have specified those under Schedule 2, Para 6, and therefore that really becomes, for the purposes of the GST law, it effectively becomes a supply simpliciter. To say it's a supply of services, I really did not look into the elements of the supply, whether it's goods or services. And of course, the question here, which will bother everyone, is that does this mean that in the case of works contracts, the concept of divisible contract is dead? Can I still have divisible contracts for supply of machinery and a separate contract for installation, commissioning, erection, installation and commissioning? And the answer is no, this concept is not dead. Just because you have two separate contracts, it doesn't mean that now it has to be compulsorily bundled into a single transaction. The two concepts remain on their own. The two transactions, which is a supply and a separate contract for erection, installation and commissioning, will survive as independent supplies by themselves. Of course, we had the same problem when we were discussing the works contracts law under the old regime, to say that do these two contracts really represent two independent transactions, or are these really two documents giving effect to a single transaction itself? To say it's really a divisible contract evidenced by cross-fall breach terms and so many clauses of the contracts and the performance guarantees and so on and so forth. So you still need to ensure that if you still have everything which is distinct, contracts which are distinct, roles and responsibilities clearly identified, these transactions to my mind still continue to be distinct transactions, distinct supplies, and they will not have to be bundled with one another. If you look at supply of a DG set with installation, and I think we already discussed this, to my mind this should be really in the nature of a supply, and therefore this will really be a supply simpliciter. It's not going to be looked at upon, or should not be interpreted to be in the nature of a composite supply or a mixed supply. Everyone is very quiet, so now I'll have to start asking questions to you all. So unless some questions come through from you guys, we'll have the Q&A session in between. Yes.
There is supply and supply really makes difference then?
Yes, sir. Between the supply and mixed supply, it could. For example, let's take an example that my transportation charges is 18% in a transaction where my rate of tax on the goods, solar panels, is 5%. If I go and say this is a mixed supply, then you will say I charge the whole solar panel 18% and not 5%. So I'll have to really distinguish to say that it is not a mixed supply, it is still a supply simpliciter.
So in fact, if you see what you're talking about, whether it is just a supply simpliciter or something, in fact the illustration that they have given is actually very misleading. They have given us very misleading illustration that they have given. When they say that there will obviously be a component of transport along with that, there will obviously be that. So that I don't think that illustration actually makes it worse. It makes it more confusing.
So that illustrations, that's why I was going back, and that's why I started with the old provisions of the BST and the MBAT Act, where we specifically talked about when separately charged. And therefore this really should come into play when I'm separately charging, when I'm separately contracting, or there's a separate requirement from the buyer for these services or these requirements. If he's going to obviously go and have a X warehouse pickup, obviously this question isn't going to arise. And therefore, if I'm bundling this into my general price, then that's why I'm trying to highlight that this continues to be a supply simpliciter. It doesn't fall into a composite or a mixed. Yeah.
No, but
yes, sir.
Supply simpliciter, DG set, has to be installed.
Yes.
Still it is single.
Supply simpliciter. Yeah.
Why not mixed supply?
Because a DG set with the nature of the transaction will always come with installation. Let me give you a slightly easier example. Whenever I buy a fan, the shopkeeper always comes with the fan. He comes to my house, he fixes it.
But that was a concept when this complete supply concept was known as a ban.
Yes.
Now, having this, and when we say there are two elements joined together for single price, then every time we will be supply.
But that is why, sir, when there are two individual supplies, did I really bargain for two individual supplies? Did I ask for it? Or my offer already included my installation? When my offer included installation, and therefore I'm always going to sell it along with installation, to my mind it still should not really be going into the definition of mixed supply. We'll have to treat it as a supply simpliciter. Otherwise we'll have mayhem. Every time we are going to have an assessment which says everything is a mixed supply, because even if I'm doing catering, I had to take a taxi and I had to go somewhere else, therefore that's also mixed supply. And that's why you go into say what are your expenses incurred to really make the provision, supply the goods or services, and therefore this expenses should not have a bearing on the output. Your input should not have a bearing on the output as a first principle. And second is, just because multiple activities need to be undertaken, that does not really take you into the discussion of a composite or mixed. It still may be in the nature of a supply simplicity. Yes, sir.
You said in GST regime, both divisible contract will survive. But when a contract is attained, normally nobody is all tax planning, whatever you are doing is fast. Now, I don't think divisible will survive because normally people want to have a performance guarantee. Unless the project is installed and given me into a running condition,
Right.
I will not accept. So, will this concept is a good concept in GST regime? What is your view?
I think this really does not, according to me, does not change under the GST regime. Earlier also you had the same problem to say if I had to give a performance guarantee, and in a divisible contract I had to give two performance guarantee. One performance guarantee for the equipment supplied, other guarantee for the work done towards the erection, installation and commissioning. Whenever I was giving a common performance guarantee, then obviously we were diluting the whole concept of a divisible contract. I think the same principle applies today also. I'll have to still satisfy all those tests, and therefore these tests are not going away. They are going to remain with us for the next 30 years again.
Even the clauses of cross-fall clause also there in both the contracts, performance guarantee. Still, in GST, it will be treated as a separate contract.
No, if you have cross-fall, so all these clauses, Vijay will have to look at and then decide is it really divisible or not. In fact, you saw this on solar panels, you saw this decision AR of Andhra Pradesh, Dinesh Kumar Agrawal. They have really discussed this. They have said there are two agreements, but there are cross-fall breach terms, therefore effectively there is a single contract and it's a works contract. So those have been discussed. So you'll have to still go ahead and address all those questions.
But what I am trying to say is to supplement you is what is offered by the supplier is important. If various elements are considered as a part of the single offer, there is a single supply.
And a single supply.
Yes.
Right.
So if it is taking your example and CB by saying whether it will be looked at as mixed supply or composite, one will have to see what is the part of negotiation. Were there elements to achieve a price which was finally offered and agreed to be supplied, then it becomes a single supply. And these are only elements which are negotiated and expected from a contract separately, that becomes a part of composite supply, mixed supply. Then you examine whether it is composite and then what is principle, and if it is not so, is it mixed or not. That is what I believe should be
the way.
If I
am in agreement with Rajat Bhai.
Everything would become a single supply.
Not always. That is why did you in the past, why did you have for certain supplies of say a DG set, so in certain transactions you said supply of DG set 1 crore, or you said supply of DG set 1 crore, installation charges or transit insurance 30,000 rupees, freight so much. So why did you have that? The same reasons for which you split your cost, your base cost with the additional charges, the same reasons you are going to continue or not continue doing it.
But then everyone would do that way. Well, by what you said, one is 5% and other is 28%. I will do that only and then come to that this would 5%.
So then it's effectively how are you selling your goods or services. So how are you doing business, and that will really govern it. You can do it.
So there is also a school of thought looking at that illustration that we spoke about, saying that suppose when we are talking about supply simplicity or something. Now the point is that even if you talk about a supply simplicity or say that there are incidental services and options, say that you don't consider anything as a supply simplicity. Even if you actually treat it as say a composite supply, you will eventually come to the same conclusion.
Yes. In many cases, even though you evaluate something from the lens of the composite supply, it is still effectively the principal supply will be the supply of goods. Therefore, you will come back to supply simplicity, no doubt. But sometimes, if you are not careful, you might jump into mixed. And that's why you need to be very clear, maybe in your assessment, to say, are you talking about a composite or a supply simplicity? Because then the officer will say, now there is a single price. The minute there is a single price, it is not composite, and we have one AER also on that, and therefore it goes into mixed.
The UPS.
The UPS one.
The solar panel installation.
We'll come to solar panel installation separately. Just give me 10 minutes.
Okay.
I'm going to go a little further. Supply of cell phones, we had the huge problem for in Nokia. The Supreme Court said these are two distinct supplies. So where does this really fall? Having said that these are two transactions, effectively, if it's a single price, will it now be the a mixed supply? Because you are having two or more individual supplies supplied in conjunction for a single price. Fortunately, we have something which is not a composite supply. Two or more taxable supplies, charger and the cell phone, or charger and your laptop or your laptop bag, which is naturally bundled, supplied in conjunction. In the ordinary course of business, principal supply is my laptop or my charger, and therefore we fortunately are getting now covered over here. That Nokia controversy really stands at rest. In the West Bengal matter which Aditya mentioned, the AAR did say the switching AVO electro power, they said UPS and batteries is a mixed supply. They said since it's a single price, I will not treat it as a composite, I will treat it as a mixed, and they said the rate applicable to the battery will apply to the UPS. So this is where, sir, CB sir, the problem is how it can be used to also take it to the other to the higher rate. And therefore, if I am able to get out of even this discussion and remain in my supply, I would probably be a little more happier, or maybe I have one more level of defense.
Now, whether possible to say the single supply in spite of having this element of service installation, something like that.
So that is precisely what I am laying before this house to say. Do you really need to say that every time my supplier has to do multiple activities? Will it always go out of the single supply or supply simpliciter and fall into composite or mixed? To my mind, it should not be that way. Supply of oxygens, rental charges for cylinders, sure.
Point that, sir, when we were discussing CB sir, the one point that we discussed and which I would like to see, there was a difference of opinion on this as well. Where at one point of time I was of this opinion that the whole concept of bringing in the concept of composite supply was, if you go by this route, you will end up in having a single supply, if at all it is to be treated as a single supply. But what we discussed is, we all know that for supply of any service, some goods will always be used, and while supplying any goods, some services will always be used. So the distinction that we have been trying to make is that what can be said to be supplied along with something else, and what can be said to be used for supplying a particular commodity. So in this UPS case, where they distinguished is that when you are supplying a UPS along with battery, they are saying that you can buy the UPS separately, you can buy the battery separately, so that it is, when you combine it and you are selling it as a single price, you are going to treat it as a mixed supply. And when the battery is included in the UPS itself, then it is an indivisible supply, and that is why it is a composite supply.
Good.
That's absolutely right. I think we are still going to have 20 years of litigation on this, and this is going to be one area which is, I believe, having the maximum litigation in the next, 15 years. Supply of oxygen, rental charges for cylinders. We have had these cases. I supply the gas, I charge a rental for the cylinder. Where should I fall? Is it naturally bundled? Is it not naturally bundled? Some thoughts? Now is my Q&A time. No one? To my mind, it will obviously be a composite.
Naturally bundled.
It is naturally bundled. Yes, sir.
One judgment of Supreme Court which says it is not naturally bundled. This is Parind Mehta for the award as carbon less.
Okay.
Giving the cylinder as a separate supply and liable for VAT.
It is a separate supply, no doubt. That is a leasing.
Right.
Yeah.
But there again, so the product which was there inside it, and this was held to be separate thing.
Separate transactions.
Right.
Just the way Nokia said, right?
That means if I forget to meet supply,
Correct.
and the ancillary supply of this, and therefore they held that this is leasing.
Rahul, the same way Nokia said that there are two transactions for the cell phone and the charger. In that decision, I don't recollect the name, but there was, which says the supply of gas and the cylinders where you are charging a rental charge is a separate transfer of the right to use the cylinders. Therefore, again, they said there are two supplies.
So my query is this: why will that logic not apply over here and help it to be a mixed supply?
That logic there is there, no doubt about that. That logic still applies. The only question is it naturally bundled or not naturally bundled? The question is, I can supply the oxygen to you, But how will I convey it to you? I have to give a mode of conveyance, which is going to be cylinders. The minute I send the cylinders to your factory or to your hospital, you need to return it. Therefore, I charge you a rental for the cylinder. And therefore, as a natural progression to my supply, I also need to give you the cylinders. I'll charge you for the cylinders, or I can build the rental for the cylinder for say 10 days, 15 days into the price and charge you after the 10 days lapse and you don't return the cylinder. And therefore, natural progression is that this will be a bundle naturally supplied in conjunction so as to enable you to take delivery of the cylinder of the gas, and therefore it should fall under composite.
So why can't we say that when you are charging separately for the cylinders, suppose you cannot supply oxygen without cylinders, you are actually supplying oxygen, you were saying.
Right.
You may collect the deposit for it, or you may build it in the price of oxygen. Where I am charging it separately, why can't I say that there is a separate supply of this cylinder? And this is very common. You have taken an oxygen and cylinder as an example. Let us take Pepsi and crates.
Right.
Right. This crates which Pepsi gives.
Right.
Without this, bottles will go down. I mean, if there is a breakage will be there.
Breakage, yeah.
Losses will be there.
Right.
So they give it in crates. They charge something for crates. Let us say. So whether that crates along with this Pepsi bottle will be a composite supply or natural bundle, or when you are charging separately for the crates, means the intention or the negotiation which we are talking about. Taking into Russian.
Yes.
United Brewery.
Yes.
United Brewery, Britannia Industry.
Yes. So in the example of crates, bottles, cylinders, it's a mode of conveyance which has been given on a returnable basis, where you are charging for the use of the conveyance, the mode of conveyance, and therefore that is given or never offered as a separate transaction. It is always offered only in an instance where you're going to buy the gas or the cool drinks from me, and therefore as a mode of conveyance, the logical answer should be that it gets bundled. Now, to my mind, it gets bundled and it goes into composite. It should never go to mixed. The answer is, even with composite, it will still fall into effectively the rate of tax will be applied, which will be the rate applicable to the cylinders, or to the oxygen or to the aerated drinks. So I personally at least feel no, it will not be distinct supply, because that is not your business. Ultimately, you will have to see how do you offer, what is the nature of the business, what are you engaged in? Are you engaged in leasing of cylinders, empty cylinders by themselves, which you are not? To whom do you offer? If I go and say I only want cylinders, I don't want the gas, will you provide it to me? Answer is no. Therefore, it falls into nationally bundled.
Say you bring your own container and give you gas in gas.
That's also possible. That's also possible.
Every fact should be same. What is the lower rate you have to apply?
So that is a structuring you need to do. Hotel accommodation. Bed with meals, American or continental plan. Any doubts? No doubts, right? That this is going to be a composite supply because there is naturally bundled. The meals are naturally bundled into the accommodation services. What about airport pickup and drop? It's usually, if airport pickup and drop is given as part of your accommodation, single price, naturally bundled. What if you book it separately? Then what happens? And this is going to be a real problem. Will you say, if I book it separately and says my 5,000 rupees or 8,000 rupees per night includes meals, does not include anything else, therefore say yes, I'll pay you 2,000 rupees extra, can you also include airport pickup and drop? Will it become a separate service? A supply simpliciter, 5% rent a cap? Or will I go into bundle, 28% if it's a 5-star, or somewhere else? A separate. Is separate, it should be so. But what happens in laundry? Same, I think here also, it should be a transaction which is a single supply, and therefore it will be taxed accordingly. And same for the case of restaurant services.
Can we say that most of the optional services which are there would be supply space?
Whatever is optional will be because there is a separate contract for it. Separate line item, separately contracted. You may or may not avail it. So then it will be a separate supply simplicity. Is optional.
Luxury tax they have said optional services are not to club together.
It is the price of the yes.
Sir,
yes.
I need your opinion on this. So, Schedule 2, Para 6 says that composite supply includes restaurant services. but it excludes other than alcoholic drinks. Now, let's say in hotel accommodation needs or just a restaurant service per se, there is an alcoholic drink involved. Would you say that it still falls under the realm of composite supply, or does it then move into a mix?
So alcoholic drink is not a taxable supply.
So yes, so technically it can't fall under composite because composite supply definition says that is where it's coming from.
Right.
Composite supply definition says 2 or more taxable supplies.
No, so
Where alcohol is not a taxable supply, how can it be composite?
So that's what I'm driving at. Can you read it such that it says composite supply means 2 or more taxable supplies and which are naturally bundled. So it can it be said that 2 or more should be taxable, but the other supplies involved can be non-taxable.
So then you will go to mixed supply.
No.
If you go to mixed supply, then what you will do is you will say individual supplies, one of which is not taxable. So you'll have to take the highest rate of the taxable supplies.
So the eventual answer is going to be the same. What I'm saying is instead of it saying that restaurant involves an ambience, service, food, so there are a lot of services involved.
Correct.
So 2 or more taxable supplies is better. Okay, it is naturally bundled. That's what everyone agrees. Nowhere it says that all the supplies has to be taxable. Can you still say it is composite?
Nowhere it says all the supplies have to be taxable in
composite supply. All it says is 2 or more should be taxable.
Liquor is not liable to tax under GST.
Of course.
No, that's fine. But I don't want them to interpret it as mixed and then go into all that.
No. Here it says 2 or more taxable means all of them have to be taxable. You cannot say 2 or more, this are out of 7, 6 are taxable and
Can
therefore.
I put a further question to this, sir? I will give you, like we are in this, no? I will give you a narrow it down. You go to a restaurant and bar where they serve liquor, they serve you this chakna, and then they also serve you food. Okay. Now, if you go and have food, now they are billing you separately for food. They are billing you separately for the alcohol. Chakna is complimentary. Okay. Now we are charging VAT on the drinks and this. So my question was, and if you read the definition of taxable supply and non-taxable supply, so taxable supply, if you will realize that whatever is not liable to GST is also a part of exempt supply. So when the definition itself says 2 or more taxable supplies, can tomorrow anyone stand up and say that it cannot be a composite supply? Especially when the question that I had presented was where you don't have dinner, okay, and where you only go and you have your chakna cover and drinks. So can tomorrow anyone say that you are mixing the price and you have to split it and then you have to, why are you not charging?
Sorry, I have one slide on that. Maybe my interpretation may not be very accurate, but let's come to that. Give me 2 minutes, we'll come to that. 2 or 3 minutes, we'll come to that. Yeah.
See, I want to hear with this example, how the cocktail will stand. Some people say that GST is also applicable and the liquor is also applicable.
We'll just come to that, sir. We'll just come to that. Just let's take 2-3 slides. We'll come to that. What about laptops, automobiles with extended warranty or additional warranty? Now this is again going to be a new area. We are going to have a lot of problems. You may opt for this at the time of purchase. You may opt for it later on. If when I buy a car, I always pay a little bit for the extended warranty of 2 more years. Will you say for that extended warranty now, it's a bundled supply, car is my principal supply, therefore an extended warranty also you pay 50%, 48%, or will I pay 18% on the extended warranty? Of course, if I go and buy it after 1 year, after 2 years, no problem, it's a distinct supply, independent supply, and therefore there is no challenge at all. Even here, to my mind, when we are looking, it says supplied in conjunction. To my mind, extended warranty is not supplied in conjunction. You book it, the supply only starts after 2 years, after 3 years after your warranty expires, and therefore this really should fall as a single or a supply simpliciter. It doesn't get bundled or doesn't have to be bundled as such.
So can we also put this in the same area where it is an optional?
Absolutely. Yes. Now, of course, you are aware of the latest BU Bhandari's case, which is going to really throw things into a different perspective altogether. It's under the VAT law, where they have said that you also have to pay VAT on your registration charge of your vehicle. So road tax also has to be taxed. Insurance also has to be taxed. Now you are going to obviously going to extend this to the GST law and try and levy 48% or 46% on these transactions. So again, that's something which needs to be thought of. Let's quickly run through photography contracts. President sir, we can extend by 5-7 minutes. We're already 5 minutes beyond. Photography contracts, where will we fall? We have always debated this. We have said it's a composite supply of services and supply of material. When you talk about,
That is a service simplicity.
I agree. I believe it's a service simplicity.
It's a service
It is.
simplicity. Let's make it easy. Let's forget.
To my mind, everything doesn't. The concepts of composite supply also will change. Some of these which were composite earlier may become simpliciter, supply simpliciter, and therefore here my personal belief is that these transactions will become supply simpliciter. It's in the nature of a service. We
When we're talking about photography contracts, we're talking about only shooting or we're talking about printing.
both shooting and printing.
Both the services.
Yes,
Your
yes,
service.
yes. Because you're effectively, if I'm calling a photographer for a marriage function, humongous. For a marriage function, I want him to take the photographs and provide me the prints.
No, I mean today's date there is little different practice going on because they only charge you for per day shooting of let's say 3 hours, 4 hours, whatever.
Right.
Then
Printing is
you have to
different.
select and give them accordingly. They'll build an album for you, 300 photos, 400 photos.
I'm still living in the BC Kame age. So,
Yeah, no, so
I don't know.
So the thing with photography is that the nature of service itself has changed significantly.
Now it is image industry, not no
But even if I am of the opinion that even if we look at it, not going into whether it is when you select and this, but if you're going into the photography and supply of album part, even if you look at it from the lens of composite supply, we'll still end up that becoming a service because that is what the entire purpose of it.
Correct. You should end up paying.
There is not always a need to go into.
Yeah, that is what is left. Said at
Rahul,
But
but coming back to your point, saying that suppose the contract itself says that you have the photography service and they have billed you for like 300 photos that you have to pick and send. So that's not really an option for you. The contract itself would have
I cannot go with him. I can go with another.
No, I am saying I don't know. कैसा है शादी नहीं हुआ. So what I am saying is that suppose there is a contract which is in which I am taking a photography services from say Expires art studio, and the contract has that you pick 300 photographs and that will print it. In that case, it will be service.
How does it happen?
Usually you say 10,000 rupees. We'll take the photographs and you select. We'll give you up to 300.
Yeah, that is
More than 300, you pay extra.
It depends.
Yeah.
So per album they'll charge you another 10,000 rupees, let us say. But and the thing is, they have option to you that you may go with him for the album, or you may go for any other person for the album.
But then that price component will go down. No,
No, he's already charging. There is a 2-component price. Two-part tariff.
Then what you had told me. It
One
will
is
all depend on how you frame the contract.
So basically, go for West Bengal,
So
yeah.
basically, what is
Yeah.
attention?
Photo Products Company Private Limited. They have said it's a pure service. Again, everything depends on the contract. How are you going to structure terms and conditions? Yeah.
I may say, I'm also view that it's service. The second thing that is printing is a
Only.
different service than photography, according to me. When I gave him a contract for 300 photographs printed and given to me in the form of an album, that may not classify as photography.
That might go into printing services. That might go into printing
The
services.
rate of tax can change.
Could
It
change.
can become a mix up. That's
Yes.
my own problem.
I agree with you. Then that means you're saying there are two levels of services or two transactions of services. One is really taking the photographs, other is really making the album and giving you, which could constitute a separate supply simpliciter. And you need to then evaluate that. Which is again the next one, printing contracts. Where are we here? There's a very simple answer to this. It is supply simpliciter. It is either supply of goods or supply of services. So far nobody has said anywhere that is a composite supply. So I think to that extent at least your problem is resolved. We have the clarification circular of October 2017 also effectively is clarifying the same thing. Yeah.
Their association itself has given a large explanation to all the printers of the members of their association.
Why it's a supply.
Interpreting that circular and confusing everyone more.
Right. Okay. Passenger air transport. In-flight meals. No doubt. Full fare service. In-flight meals. No doubt it's a composite service. It's a given part of the services. Meals. Purchase of meals during the flight. I think it should be obviously a separate supply. There is no problem for this.
So the outdoor catering or
Supply of food. Sorry, supply of food or supply of
I mean to
Service of food.
like whether it's sale of food or it's supply of service.
it's a catering service. It's supply of food. Sorry, it's a service. It's a supply of a service. It's not supply of goods. It's a supply of service. What happens if you pre-book the meals? When I'm booking on Indigo, I have the option of paying 500 rupees extra for my samosas. Is it advance? Is it supplied in conjunction? Am I bundling it? I have an offer to bundle it. Am I bundling it?
So it depends.
It will become a little grey. Yes, ma'am.
If you are booking at the time of booking your ticket, then it can fall under the composite. If after you booked it, you go into manage your booking and booking, then it is a separate, so it's a grey.
Supply between that and
That's fine. That's fine. But you are entered into.
is it naturally bundled is the question.
No, the question is supply is always in conjunction. The only question is does it constitute a separate transaction? Does it constitute a same transaction along with it? I think this is really going to harass us at some point in time to say if I pre-book my meal, it might go into a composite supply. I'm not very certain, but I think probably we are going to have a little challenge to say it goes into composite supply. It's naturally bundled. ताज में बंडल अरे जेटर में बंडल करके मिलता है, इंडिगो में नहीं मिलता है. You have to pay for it separately.
I can
it has to be consumed there only.
It has to be consumed there. Yeah. Chalo.
yes on the flight.
That is a bundle price also.
This will not end, sir. This will not end.
This will not end. Only fortunately only 2-3 slides. Flight with hotel, no doubt. Flights with hotel is a mixed supply.
Yeah.
It may not be tour operators. Because when you are booking your, if it's a package, you might go into the tour operators.
Yes.
But when you're booking your flight, you have an option to book your hotel also. You choose the hotel, then you might go into a mixed supply because these are not naturally bundled. Some places you can also book your car. To say you book the flight and you book your car, hotel is your own. So all of these, again, if it's a single price, it becomes a mixed supply. If it's separate prices, no problem. These are supply simpliciter. The passenger transportation and your accommodation services, right? I think we have this. Single price, I have said it's a composite supply. I may not be really clear about this, but as Umang was asking that question, Umang, you want to continue from here?
So, I was also of the opinion that it can be a composite supply, irrespective the definition states that it's a 2 or more common taxable supplies. What I'm saying is the entire contract should include 2 or more taxable supplies, and another supply, an ancillary supply, can be of a non-taxable or an exempt. We can deliberate it on.
I think maybe a little stretch. Maybe my answer over here is also not accurate or is not right. I
But then
rethink on it.
valuation
No,
issues
valuation issues will come, but I don't think that in order to fall within composite supply, all the elements or all the individual supplies have to be taxable. Even if one of them is not, it doesn't. It's not. So my apologies. This particular answer on the screen is not right. Yes, Janak bhai.
Section 2 start with data
Unless the context requires otherwise.
in case of the liquor. Actually, it goes into mixed supply because it is one is a taxable, one is not taxable. So it goes in mixed supply. When we integrate mixed supply, then the reference to the content requires other meaning, and otherwise the liquor which is not taxable, the GST law becomes taxable. So Mysore Court and the other judgment
It is Mysore.
it will go out of the mixed supply.
So
It has to be treated to separate supply, one supply for the liquor and supply of the food. And the food will be taxed as the registry estimated and taxed at the rate of the food.
So if I charge separately, no doubt. If I charge, yeah, single price. Single price.
In case of the liquor, the liquor rules require that you cannot serve the liquor without
You have to require a separate invoice for the liquor. The liquor rules require, therefore you'll always have a separate. So okay, let's park this. We just rather delete this discussion from this slide. Bar with Aditya, your example. Bar services, liquor with sides or munching. It's a supply simpliciter. To my mind, doesn't get taxed under the GST law. It does not become a mixed supply, because I'm saying you buy a cocktail, you'll get munchings free. Munching is built into the supply of the liquor, therefore it completely goes out of the GST law, and therefore there is no liability for tax. Sorry?
Food and liquor together.
Food and liquor we discussed the previous slide.
Price is built into the liquor.
It has to do basic charges. I went to a restaurant where there was a buffet. Buffet with liquor was for 3,500, and only buffet food buffet was for 2,500. So there is a.
They usually give a separate bill for that.
There was no separate bill. It was no separate bill.
But inside they are doing it.
They will.
They are doing buffet with liquor for 3,500 and only buffet for 2,500.
I think
both the ways. That day pura और इसमें pura.
you'll have a problem. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to skip this example. We have had enough discussion on this.
But here I want cocktail to be distinguished.
You have this one?
Cocktail. Cocktail it is a mix. It is that
Sorry.
In liquor I have cocktail.
Huh.
For example, we are saying munching is free. But is it not inducing to drink more? There is the inducement and there is the
Looking at the kind of show cause notices the DGCI is issuing, yes, there will be an inducement allegation also. You have a good idea. नहीं होगा sir, don't worry.
There is some clause that deemed supply inducement and
Declared service, earlier declared service. Sorry, it's in the definition of consideration. Anything inducement towards to do or not to do something. Agreeing to an obligation to do an act, refrain from an act, or to tolerate an act or a situation, something to that effect. Yeah. I don't think that's a problem. Yes, Ranji.
cocktail I want to find.
Cocktail meaning?
See, cocktail, how is it prepared? It is certain juices are put into that.
Right.
Plus certain quantity of liquor is also put into that. And they made it cocktail and they are served. Whether it will be how it will be.
Sir, single supply.
Sir, you're now this
single supply.
This is good to prove your point in the beginning. Sir,
GST people are saying that they want tax.
No. It is an alcoholic drink.
Ask them to issue a show cause notice and send it to the GST council that this is the kind of madness that we are seeing.
They are not supplying the soft drink.
It is
along with
effectively it is saying.
It is an alcoholic drink. So soft drinks are being used in supplying that alcoholic drink. That's all.
It is, you are effectively saying that they want to really tax the ingredients. Like you ordered for jalfrezi and therefore he wants to tax the potato separately and the onion separately and the masala separately. It is ultimately just one supply in your case of a cocktail, and therefore you have to go by that. If it's alcoholic, then it will go under VAT. You don't have to pay GST. Non-alcoholic, you are going to obviously pay GST. They'll start splitting the values. Yes. Yes, solar. Now here again, there's a lot of confusion over here. If it's a solar power system or a solar power plant which is being set up, supply, installation, commissioning, to my mind, becomes a works contract. Just the way it was for a regular power plant which we were talking about, or maybe even for a air conditioning plant. If it is, you could split it into a divisible contract to say supply of the solar panels 5%, and then installation, erection, commissioning, then it will go under two distinct contracts of 5 and 18% towards the erection, installation and commissioning. And therefore this is the way you'll have to read this. Now we already have 4 different advanced rulings on this. Karnataka has said it's not composite. AP has said again it's possible to split it. In the AP AR again they said yes, you could have split contracts, but since there are cost per breach terms, they are saying it may not be split. Had they not been, they would have perhaps held that these are divisible contracts. Maharashtra is the only one which is very consistent to say this is always a works contracts, pay at the highest rate, 18%. But I think this is going to be arguable. Everything will depend on the facts of the case. Everything will depend on your contracts, roles, responsibilities, everything. Yes. Of course, whether it results in an immovable property. Therefore, when we talk about a solar power plant or a solar power system, you are not only talking about just putting the panels. you're actually talking about the cabling, the what shall I say, the substations, transmission systems connected into the transmission grid, and therefore you're setting up the whole plant. When you're setting up the whole plant, obviously it becomes an immovable.
It will be how the works contract.
It will be works contract.
It will be works contracts. Then it will be a works contract. Then it will be a works contract. So advisable to split
There is
it.
a heading, solar power generating system.
Yes.
You go straight away into that and exemption.
Solar 5%.
That's the issue, no? All this time. So ultimately you're trying to come to that what is system, vis-a-vis plant, vis-a-vis machinery.
Yeah.
So a single supply.
So if it's a solar power generating system, but it is different than a solar power generating plant.
I do not know, but this is what is meant.
Sir, I have
Yes.
a question related to this, which we have already discussed, but I would like your thoughts on this now.
If I remember what my answer was 2 months ago.
No, it will be consistent.
It changes every
So
month.
yeah. So that is the whole point of asking it again. With regard to these pump systems, okay, water pump system, submersible pumps or any such system. Now, why I am talking about is that there is an entry for solar power system. There is no entry for pump
Submersible
systems.
pumps.
There is only
Pump sets.
only an entry for a pump.
Pump and pump sets.
So a pump and a pump set, which is at 12%. Now what all these people are doing, they are charging 12%. The contract is such that they charge one single price for the entire system, which includes the panels, the pipe, the plumbing, the pipes, the electricity structure, everything, as well as the pump.
Right.
So a pump may be just a pump, it may be automated, it may be electric. So that they are treating the entire contract basically as a composite contract and treating it as a pump set.
Right.
So what is your opinion on this, and can this be considered or held to be, because there is no specific AR on this. There was only one AR where they said that clean water pump and sewage water, that is where they are distinguished. So can they say that this is a works contract? Because I am pretty sure if somebody goes in for an advance booking in Maharashtra, they will say that this is a works contract. So liable to taxability was.
Probably the way I can imagine the whole transaction, probably not a works contract, because I don't think you will end up classifying the pump itself, which is the main component or the major component, as a immobile property. Maybe the piping system may be so immobile, you may grout it or you may just fix it along on the bed. But the pump by itself can be removed, can be dismantled, can be refixed, and therefore I think it probably will not be a works
What
contract.
if there is a single price being charged for the entire contract?
It's always the case.
Which is usually the case.
Is always the case, sir. In fact, in my opinion, you are in sticky territory if you go into the composite supply.
That is
You
a
treat it as a supply simpliciter. As you said, you treat it as a supply simpliciter.
Right.
You are in sticky territory if you go into composite supply, and then you say that maybe it's a mixed supply also, pipeline, or it is maybe resulting.
No, so what you were saying is that you treat it as a supply simpliciter of a pump.
Let me finish. What I'm trying to say is, it is a supply simpliciter. For the simple reason, you see the intention of the schedule also. Whether you are treating it as a pump system or a pump set, whether they only want to treat trading as pump sets and that as a 12%. That is not the case.
So installation also,
inherently have a component of installation.
right? Always.
So that is why it will be a supply simpliciter of pump set only. Always.
Okay. So Rahul, Parth is saying that the pump set always comes with all the accessories, and therefore it is usually installed together. Since it is coming along with all the accessories, therefore it will always be a supply simpliciter of the pump set. Perhaps that would be the way of looking at it.
The unfortunate part it does not. It is not a standardized contract. These contracts are highly customized contracts in relation to each building, and in most cases these pumps are, especially for new buildings, these pipelines are concealed. So if you want to look at that, then unless you break it, you will not be able to remove.
Correct. I think that facts have to be seen. Will be done in just half a minute. The last was franchise services. I just wanted to highlight franchise services largely will have lots of services. One of them is a trademark. Trademark is getting taxed at 12%. All the other services are getting taxed at 18%. Now here, this to my mind is a supply simpliciter of franchise services distinct from the individual activities which are required to be done by the franchisor who is giving the franchise. and therefore you should not really go into these individual activities. Everything comes into the 18% bracket. I'm sorry, I've really exceeded my time, but the discussion took me away. Thank you so much.